Jim, welcome to the program. We're happy to have you back. I'm glad you're doing well. Burt has set you up for some insight. I'm going to turn it over to you and let you kind of give us a view of the landscape on what's going on there in Washington, D.C.
Right. Well, thank you, Phil, and thank you, Burt. And just to, I'm going to talk a little bit about Congress, and just to sort of piggyback a little bit on what Burt was saying. I think the Chevron deference case is also going to impact Congress and the way that they write laws. Over the last several decades, Congress, especially on some of these big laws that they've written, they get to a certain point and then they stop agreeing on things, or they get tired or whatever, and they said, let's just put a line in there that gives some agency a rulemaking authority, and we'll let them figure out this little detail that we can't agree on, right? So
Jim, the quote from Nancy Pelosi many years ago that we have to pass it to find out what's in it is coming back to my memory right now.
Right, absolutely.
It's so ridiculous, isn't it?
Right. So it's actually gonna put a little bit more onus on Congress to actually get down a little bit more into the weeds of what exactly they mean and what they're exactly trying to accomplish when they are passing legislation, instead of just giving some broad sweeping authority to administrative agency of unelected bureaucrats.
Now, doesn't that, I mean, so to me, maybe you guys can give me some insight, but I think that's a good thing, right? I mean, because sometimes these are very recklessly done, and the consequences that come out of these are unintended consequences. Maybe unintended, if not unintended, they're hidden agendas, right, at a minimum.
I think, Phil, it depends on who you ask, right?
Okay.
If you ask me, I would say, yes, this is the way the system is set up. This is the way it's supposed to be. If you don't like the way the laws are written, your recourse is to vote out your member of Congress. Others would say, to the point I think that Burt brought up about how sort of big the country's come, how sweeping and the federal government has become, that they're saying, hey, if Congress is writing a statute about regulatory inspectors on deep sea fishing vessels, which is what the facts of this Chevron deference case that the Supreme Court is talking about, like, they can't possibly know that. So we do have to give some authority to NOAA, the National Oceanographic Administrative Agency, or whatever, to sort of figure things out. So it sort of depends on your view of things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my view is the one that really matters the most, in my opinion, anyway, according to my wife. So we'll just go with that.
It's
all right,
your
go
show.
ahead, Tim. Keep going. Yeah.
It's your show, right? So Congress. I'm talking about them writing laws, right? So the 118th Congress they see the finish line, right? At the end of the year, they're done. They all turn into pumpkins. Any legislation that isn't passed, that's pending right now, that all goes poof, turns into dust, right? They got to reintroduce it in the next Congress. So they're sort of looking, they've got the end of the calendar year. They've got the elections coming up. In November, they've got August, where they generally, take a break for summer. Not a lot of time to legislate, right? And in contrast to the previous Congress, where we saw them pass workplace legislation like the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, the prohibition on arbitrating sexual harassment claims, the Speak Out Act relating to non-disclosure agreements. We had the Pump Act for nursing mothers. We had some prevailing wage issues, some multi-employer pension plan legislation passed. We haven't seen any of that, right? You don't have to be living in Washington, D.C. to know why. It's because in the previous Congress, Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. In this Congress, right, Republicans have been controlling the House. So they've been sort of the bulwark against some of any of that legislation. I think that trend is going to continue for the remaining months of this year. I don't expect major labor and employment legislation coming out of Congress. I think they're going to basically just do the minimal job that they can do. And as we know, even our elected officials have some struggles to just do their the minimal work, right? Like pass funding legislation and that sort of thing. A couple of things to keep an eye on, though, despite what I just said about the lack of legislation. There could be in the lame duck session after the elections, and Congress comes back and they all know what things are going to look like in 2025. There are some issues that I'm watching that have some bipartisan interest. So things like, I mentioned the prohibition on arbitrating sexual harassment claims. Proponents of that have said, hey, why don't we expand this idea to other allegations of discrimination in the workplace? So in other words, there's a bill out there that says if you're going to you can't arbitrate an age-related discrimination claim, and that has some Republican support on that. So if you're alleging that we were discriminated because of your age under this bill, you would not be, an employer would not be permitted to arbitrate that claim with the employee. It's probably no surprise that there's some bipartisan support on that when you look at the average age of our legislators, particularly in the Senate. Practically all of them are covered by it, right? Yeah. I mean, maybe Josh Hawley and John Ossoff and maybe one or two others aren't covered, but everybody else is covered. So they just raise their hand and say, yeah, is it going to protect me? Sure. Right. So something like that is like always worth keeping your eye on. Child labor is a really interesting debate that's happening right now, because you've got some states that are because everybody's looking for workers. You've got some states that are sort of loosening up some of the restrictive requirements on child labor. But at the federal level, they've sort of taken hold of some of these unfortunate stories that we've seen over the last year and a half or so. And there's definitely some bipartisan interest in doing something about child labor. Of course, in DC, the devil is always in the details, right? So I think the thing that's most likely to gain the most support would be something like raising the penalties against employers who commit child labor violations. Again, so those are just a couple of examples of issues to watch out for. I would still bet the under in terms of whether or not that's going to pass. It's got a long way to go. But anytime you see bipartisan interest, especially in a particular issue, especially these days in Washington, D.C., it's worth keeping your eye on.
So, Jim, with the child labor, because I'll be really honest, I'm not as familiar with it. I don't see child labor violations myself with our members. Are we saying that they want to change kind of an age in which child labor is allowed or not allowed? Is there is it something along that line, or is it when you violate child labor laws, it's going to be a stiffer penalty?
I think it's more in terms of the issue that or the concept that would gain the most support would be the latter. Okay. That it would be, hey, if you do find these, especially if it's knowingly or willfully, then we're going to, jack up the penalties. Okay. But there's different, everybody's got sort of different ideas of how to address the problem. A lot of what we've seen with the child labor violations is when there's a lack of transparency in the sort of vendor contractor chain, and the sort of end user employer isn't necessarily aware that the contractor and the contractor's subcontractor might have somebody working the overnight shift.
So it's not necessarily, you can't bring in your Nike goods from China that were manufactured with child labor. We're not talking about that necessarily.
No. Okay. But yeah, there's definitely an interest, I think, in saying like, hey, if we find these violations, and depending on the level, there's different, like any other thing, there's different violations, right? It's, some is as sort of simple as record keeping, but then there's the serious ones where it's like, hey, you knowingly and willfully employed a minor, and they were using this dangerous equipment, or using, right. That's you had them working in a grain silo or something like that, or deep sea tuna fishing, something like that. That's what we're talking about. So, and you can see how the optics of that politically are very strong for those in favor of wanting to increase those penalties, right? It could be hard for a legislator to say, no, I don't want to increase penalties on employers who commit child labor violations.
Yeah, and I guess one of the reasons why I asked that is I do hear employers wishing they could sometimes employ people younger than the age of 21 to
Right.
work in their facilities, right? Because you had to be
Right.
21 or older. And, the argument is, an age-old argument. Well, I can go to war at 18. I can go to prison at 18, but, I can't drive my fork truck at 18. Those types of things.
Yeah, to be clear, it's not unlawful to employ, minors. There's just, when you do,
You gotta do it a certain way.
Yeah, there are rules, and yeah, there are some people who are very extreme, who say, who don't think a minor should be working at all. But there are other people who talk about, hey, we need workers, kids need money, kids need experience, right? So there's all those arguments too. But yeah, child labor isn't per se unlawful.
Jim, you've never been into Ames offices, but I've been over there, and I mean, Phil, sometimes he's so desperate for employees, it looks like a daycare he's running over there.
Hey, Burt, we just have an open mind to things around here from that standpoint. But this one just makes me really think about the child labor arguments I've had at home with my wife when it comes to, what do you mean he can't mow the grass? He's 17.
Right.
He can mow the grass.
Taking out the trash, emptying the dishwasher, walking the dog, that's all lawful. You can do that.
Yeah, exactly right. The child labor laws don't apply to the family businesses of small family businesses.
That, you say that, but there is, for family farms and
Right.
things like that, but there are some exceptions.
Absolutely. All right, Jim. Hey, we appreciate having you back on the program. It's always good to have you on and get an insight of what's going on in Washington. I know it's a busy time for you, so thank you for making the time to speak with our audience.
Thank you once again for tuning in to This Week at Work. If you enjoy the show, please share it with your colleagues. Forward our invites. Share the link, aimea.org/This Week at Work, or follow or subscribe wherever you get your news and entertainment, like LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're everywhere you are. And you can be part of the show. Send your questions and comments anytime to info@thisweek.work. We'll see you next week, 7:30 a.m. Central Time, when we discuss what's happening this week at work.